It is at once the most repulsive yet riveting phenomena depicted in post-apocalyptic fiction. The thought of having to consume the flesh of another human being in order for sustenance and survival is as terrifying and repugnant as it is mesmerizing. Something many of us would never entertain the thought of doing, but like a traffic accident on the road, we can't help but be transfixed by. However, for many throughout human history, this was a reality that they had to endure in order to survive. Throughout this discussion, we will explore the various types of cannibalism, the psychology of cannibalism, and what conditions would be necessary for it to be a factor, and in what capacity would it manifest if our civilization ever actually collapsed. We will also look at historical instances of famine-based cannibalism to determine the reasons why it has a distinct probability of arising, should the supply lines that fuel our society ever get cut. There are 7.5 billion people on Earth, and all of them are hungry. Less than 5% in the Western world at least are vegetarians. The only way that we all remain satisfied is if the agricultural, transport, and systems of commerce can sustain the just-in-time delivery system that has been adopted to maximize profit and minimize waste. Should this global grid be compromised, supplies would quickly run out, and chaos would soon ensue. The evacuated cities might become human hunting grounds, and the dehumanized hordes will become the wild game. Think about this. Of the predominantly urban 7.5 billion people on the planet right now, how many of them do you think know how to hunt an animal nowadays? In fact, even if there was domesticated livestock in front of them, how many people would have the foresight to breed these animals and create a perpetual source of food? How many people know how to garden? The animals would be much harder to catch than humans, whose instincts have all but atrophied in the concrete jungle over the last several hundred years. Most people in the modern gluttonous squalor can't run across the street, much less evade capture from a dedicated group of hunters. And with no horticultural skill sets, what do you think people are going to do for food? It may well be that the far-fetched zombie apocalypse is not the cause of the collapse, rather a very literal metaphor for what might transpire thereafter. We have been conditioned to think that cannibalism is so far beneath us because of the silky veneer of civility that knits us all together. Everything is so clean and fresh and polished and structured. Right now we're shrouded in a sanitized technocracy, but without it, we are just animals with no instincts left to grow food or catch food. You still think cannibalism is a far-fetched possibility? Think again. Now, if you were to ask 100 people if they would ever consume another human being in order to survive, 99% would probably say never, and none of the 100 would likely admit that they might go one step further to commit murder before the cannibalistic act if their survival depended on it, a proactive approach of sorts. But how true are these predictions? Because at the end of the day, they are only ideals that are uttered from a perspective of relative luxury and comfort. Most human beings have never experienced true deprivation, and thus have never had to come face to face with the latent beast that resides within them. It's not a question of if it would happen, because there are countless examples of history that we can draw from where it has. Rather, it's a question of what conditions might precipitate it and how exactly it would unfold. If and when resources ran out and things got down to the wire, what would it take in order for the attitudes towards cannibalism to shift to one that was more permissive of the act as opposed to how it is now? What treacherous conditions would have to arise for us to reach that point of fatal peril, where we accepted it as a normal practice? What sort of thought process would have to transpire that would have someone who is one day subsisting off caviar and aged wine in a fine restaurant to only 1 week later contemplating consuming the waiter that served them there? Social psychology tells us that culture has a significant amount of sway over our beliefs, opinions, and actions. This is evidenced in countless bodies of experimentation and research. Now, if exploiting or hunting people for food became a social norm, then most people would likely adapt this mentality, especially if they were born into it, as is the case with some cultures of the world who engage in what's called anthropophagy, which is the culturally prescribed practice of eating human flesh for ritualistic purposes. Cannibalism, therefore, is not a practice that is inherently beneath human beings. As nauseating as the notion might seem to us, and perhaps this disgust serves an evolutionary function so not to devour our own species and thus reduce our genetic variability, the absolute fact is that notion of disgust is 100% based on our subjective belief system. In all actuality, the fact that our bodies are comprised of calories and nutrients isn't concerned with our moral beliefs about what sanctity our bodies might provide our souls. If the perfect storm presented itself, 99 of those 100 people would likely succumb to the demands of their deflated stomachs. Something begins to happen when we are in a survival situation and resources and civility become increasingly sparse. We become increasingly more feral and animalistic in our behaviors. This is a survival instinct. I call this descent into animalism progressive dehumanization. The idea is that the longer the grid is down and incivility the norm, the more we will descend down the evolutionary tree, to such an extent that we behave more and more like the animals we now view as subhuman and beneath us. We begin to forego our own cerebral mental capabilities for those that will help us survive in the here and now. That is, we come to rely on our more primal reptilian brain that devours whatever it's in its midst without forethought or consideration of the consequences. Now, starvation is a process by which the body first depletes its carbohydrate stores, then of course it moves to its fat stores, then to its muscle. Then it turns off any organs which are not vital to the immediate survival, such as the liver and the stomach and intestines. So in the later stages of starvation, the body is going to reroute whatever resources it has away from the brain to the heart and its most vital organs. And in doing so, it's going to limit resources that flow to our cerebral cortex. So as this is happening, the urge to resist cannibalism becomes greatly diminished because it's in our cerebral cortex that our higher level thought capabilities lie. So you're effectively turning off the brain, and you're effectively becoming very much like the proverbial zombie that we see in movies. That you're not using your higher level brain function, rather you're just functioning on the basis of your lower reptilian brain, or your brainstem, which basically just wants to consume whatever it sees. So we progressively lose our ability to think in more sophisticated ways and thus become fueled by our lower brain functions, just like the proverbial zombie. After an SHTF situation, at the onset of total food scarcity, people would likely be staunchly opposed to the notion of consuming those who had passed on. But incrementally, as time went by, more would be warmed to the notion as the hunger set in, and it was normalized by more and more people doing it. The first to suggest it would likely be opposed, but over time people would begin to justify it. The speed at which this took place, of course, would depend on the degree of hardship they had to endure. But it wouldn't be much of a stretch for people to integrate cannibalism into their current belief systems. 10 days after the Andes plane crash, naysaying survivors eventually reconciled the notion of consuming the dead with their Catholic faith by believing that God wanted them to survive, and that it was their duty to do whatever it took to survive. This is a commonly held belief amongst most Christian people, and oddly enough, one that probably would not receive much criticism from atheists, although for different reasons. Not only does religious devotion not prevent cannibalism, it may in fact condone it under certain circumstances. The fear of death can be a maddening thing, especially for people in our society who are so conditioned to cling to life at all costs, and not just fear of our own death, but fear of the death of our own children. There were countless accounts in the Russian famine of the early 20th century that some people would kill one of their children in order to feed the other to ensure they survived. Were the people wrong for doing this? At first glance, a unanimous yes would ring out from all the idealistic critics, but with a deeper probing we see that from a strictly objectivist perspective, what that woman did was in fact very rational. In fact, if given the same task to a supercomputer, the outcome would be the same, only executed quicker with no emotion and no remorse. To sacrifice the few to save the many is only a philosophical dilemma that humans have. Would this cold and calculated style of thinking be a driving factor for some in the instance of a post-collapse environment? How do we reconcile such ethical dilemmas? If someone has already passed away and you are dying of starvation, from a strictly scientific perspective, consuming the energy of their bodies would permit you to remain vital. The only barrier in the way of you doing this would be a subjective line of reasoning that you have created in your own mind. That is, that eating people is wrong. Now, I'm not here to defend the practice of famine-based cannibalism, because I, like most civilized people, find the idea of eating another human being revolting and sickening. However, my inner logician reminds me that at the end of the day, these are only ideas that we currently have the luxury of entertaining, and that when things come down to the wire, there is nothing stopping different ideas and beliefs from emerging. Now, of course, not all cannibalism, like famine-based cannibalism, is justified. There is also a psychopathological version of cannibalism. Native American legend is that of the Wendigo spirit, now loosely referred to as Wendigo Psychosis. And although this is not officially recognized by modern psychiatry, there is some science to substantiate the less sensationalist aspects of the claim. The Wendigo was said to be a malevolent entity, a man who had become possessed after eating human flesh. Whether figurative or literal is a subject of debate. However, it served a function for many Native American cultures. The Wendigo spirit legend was used as a cultural deterrent to cannibalism amongst the Algonquin people during times of resource scarcity. So for the Algonquin people, Wendigos were embodiments of gluttony, greed, and excess. Never satisfied after killing and consuming one person, they were constantly searching for new victims. As the legend goes, whenever a Wendigo ate another person, it would grow in proportion to the meal it had just eaten, so that it could never be full. It's a fascinating plotline, to say the least. The belief was that if one turned to cannibalism in times of famine, that they would become a Wendigo. Thus, this practice was cautioned against, as what might begin as a means of mere survival on those who have passed on, can quickly turn into hunting of those who are alive. For the Algonquin people and for other Native American tribes, this served as a vital social deterrent to murderous, cannibalistic acts. Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most notorious examples of cannibalistic mass murders of the 20th century, claimed that he was entranced while committing the heinous atrocities against his victims, reporting that sometimes he would black out only later to realize what he had done. There is no better evidence of the mythical Wendigo psychosis than Jeffrey Dahmer. However, the most important discernible fact that distinguishes Dahmer from the Andes plane-crash survivors, of course, is that he was a psychopath and the other was a case of famine-based cannibalism. These were two distinctly different pursuits, the only bridge between the two being a case when someone hunted the living, not for sadistic purposes, but for survival. And it's in that middle ground that a lot of ethical dilemmas will present themselves. Now, in the 2009 movie The Road, the cannibals are depicted as villains, quite evil. But when you really think about it, and if one was to do an in-depth ethical analysis of those cannibals' actions, although I would not agree with what they did in that movie, there are many logicians who would likely be able to defend what they did. If there was no other hope, if there was no other food, and that was the only means of survival, could you really fault them for doing that? As heinous as the crimes might seem to us now, in the luxury and all our comforts that we enjoy, when you think about it, the only other option for them was to die. Now, there may be some scientific basis for the insatiability and ravenous nature for those who feed on the remains of others in order to survive. Now, obviously, psychopathic cannibalism is different than that of famine-based cannibalism, and one crossing over into another is rare. The famine-based is not by preference or interest, and of course the psychopathic sort is driven by perversion and obsessiveness. Now, dopamine is a neurochemical that is released when we eat a great meal, have sex, or do drugs in varying amounts. For instance, food may trigger a 50% rise in dopamine. Crystal meth, which is a highly addictive substance, can trigger a 1200% dopamine spike. Now, psychopaths who do cannibalistic acts are said to get a similar dopamine dump from this experience. That pleasure is created by the release of this neurochemical, and they get addicted to that release. Thus, there might be some scientific basis for Wendigo psychosis, but only for those who partake in it willingly and actually commit murder. The simple fact is, the Andes survivors did not go on to become mass murdering psychopaths. Nonetheless, psychopaths gain these euphoric feelings from the experience, and as such they must continue to do it like a drug addict who needs more and more drugs with increasing intensity. As they build more tolerance for the acts they do, they have to keep raising the bar for how they torment their victims. So cannibals not only get addicted to eating the flesh of people, but also in the hunting of their victims, in the same way a heroin addict enjoys the ritual of shooting up. It's only a matter of time before they gain more refined preferences for various types of people, young or old, different sexes, races, more refined taste, so to speak. Now, cannibalism would not be without its share of medical and hygienic hazards. In the movie The Book of Eli, you may recall that people were required to show their hands to ensure they were not cannibals. There is evidence to show that when you consume the flesh of others, you become afflicted with a trembling that is characteristic of something called Kuru disease. This is something that causes bodily tremors and delirium as a result of consuming human flesh. This is a phenomenon that has been observed in the tribes of Papua New Guinea, who partake in what's called mortuary cannibalism. So Kuru is very similar to mad cow disease in that there's a malformed protein called a prion, and when tainted meat is ingested, so are the prions, and they infiltrate and spread and cause lesions in the person's brain. This leads to dementia and then certain death. Of all the tribes who partook in anthropophagy, only some developed this Kuru disease. Those who didn't develop it were found to have a protective gene that prevented the disease. It has been found that half of the people throughout the world possess a gene that offers them a resistance to the effects of Kuru disease. What this means is that half the people in the world potentially, if they became cannibalistic, would not be prone to this fatal illness. One theory is that this resistance was from our ancient ancestors who developed immunity by surviving various outbreaks of prion-like diseases. The belief is that the cause of these prion-like outbreaks may have been cannibalistic practices. There is sufficient evidence to induce that indeed prehistoric cannibalism was in fact a normal, recurring practice. And this is no surprise because it's only in the modern day when our culture would be so refined that we might refute the practice of consuming our own species. In fact, you need to consider the fact that in those days, people didn't even know what a species was. So this is where we might want to talk a bit about prehistoric cannibalism, to see where this all began. Now, our fascination with zombification and the voracity with which hordes of starved and desperate post-humans devour one another for the simple sake of doing so, this may not solely be for the purpose of entertainment. Rather, it may relate to memories that are deep in our collective unconscious of the primal practices of our ancestors, when before written history and when there was no stigma against consuming other humans for sustenance, especially opposing tribes, this was a common practice. Scarcity of resources prompted rival tribes to consume one another. This is called exocannibalism, in contrast to endocannibalism, which is eating one's own tribesmen or family members. There is some evidence that our prehistoric ancestors practiced this and that Homo sapiens actually ate many Neanderthals. This would mean that there is something about cannibalism that may be present in our DNA. It should also be noted that numerous species partake in filial cannibalism. Now, filial cannibalism is the act of eating children. It involves eating the young, either full or in part, of one's own species. Now, this practice has been observed in fish and cats and dogs, bears, pigs, lions, elephants, and baboons, and oddly enough, our most closest evolutionary relative, chimpanzees. So in times of famine, it's no surprise that humans resort to this. From an evolutionary standpoint, this does make sense, because if the mother dies, the offspring dies anyways, whereas if the mother consumes the offspring, she may actually have a chance to reproduce in the future. What's to be taken from all of this is that somewhere in our genetics is a propensity for cannibalistic behavior. And while cannibalism is a poor long-term strategy for survival of an entire species, it's an excellent short-term strategy for the survival of an individual. Ultimately, the only difference between cannibalizing humans and eating the meat of other animals or even plants is the taboo that most societies place on the practice. This is in no way to make apologies for famine-based cannibalism, especially of the murderous sort. I personally think I might perish before succumbing to that primal urge to hunt or be hunted. But then again, that's just another thought uttered from a place of luxury and comfort. We can now discuss some historical examples to better understand the likelihood, conditions, and manner in which cannibalistic activity may unfold. I would also like to reference here a video that was done by Jeremy Hopper, I'll link his video in the description. He provides a detailed overview of famines of the 20th century and claims of cannibalism that might have ensued. Now, probably one of the most notorious famines of the 20th century was the Holodomor. This took place in the Ukraine in the 1930s. It was man-made, commissioned by the Stalinist government. Now, the exact number of deaths of this was hard to determine due to the lack of records, but it's estimated that up to 10 million people's deaths can be attributed to this famine. Evidence of widespread cannibalism was documented throughout the Holodomor, to such an extent that over 2,500 people were convicted of cannibalism. And those are only the people who were caught. There's a story of a woman doctor who wrote to a friend in June of 1933 that it was the good people of the Holodomor who died first. Those who refused to steal or to prostitute themselves died. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow man died. Parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children did. Now, if we take what happened in this scenario and apply it to a prolonged post-collapse, a widespread global disaster, it paints a pretty bleak future for mankind if all of the good people die first, and the only good people left alive were the survivors who had the foresight to prepare and defend themselves now against the hordes of impious individuals. It's a scary thought indeed. Now, in Stalinist Russia, there was widespread cannibalism that was reported also in the gulags. And now I'm going to read you an excerpt of a research paper, which was done not too long ago, and I'm going to link that in the description. Now, cannibalism was integral to the most common method of escape from the various slave labor camps that were in Siberia. Now, those who had planned such escapes were generally common criminals who, prior to their departure, enlisted a willing political prisoner or a minor pocket thief who was to be their meat or food supply for the duration of their journey. After their escape, they first consumed all the regular food they brought along, after which they killed and dissected the unsuspecting political prisoner. Then, during the remaining portion of their sojourn, they ate him. This was what happened in one of Vorkuta's notorious forced labor camps, when two murderers persuaded a well-fed cook to escape with them. The cook did not suspect that he was simply the walking food supply for the two bandits, but when the regular food ran out, it was the cook who came to be served up as their food. But the path to freedom turned out to be much longer than expected. They finished with the cook before reaching their destination. This was followed by days of hunger. Soon they began to eye each other. Fear crept into their minds. Neither of them dared to fall asleep for fear of being killed by his partner. After a while, however, one of them did fall asleep. The other one took advantage of the opportunity and slit his partner's throat, and then sliced him up for food. He did not get very far, however. 2 days later he was caught. His bag was still filled with fresh meat, the body parts of his partner. Throughout the Holodomor, people were said to be picking through horse manure to find grain, stewing leather boots, and toasting leaves and tree bark. In another case study in the early 1930s, a man named Myron Yemetz and his wife Maria had become cannibals. They had cut off their children's heads and salted them away for meat. The neighbors smelled meat frying and the smoke coming from the chimney, and noticing the absence of children, went to the house. When they asked about the children, the parents began to weep and told the whole story. The perpetrators of this act said that they would have children again, otherwise they would die in great pain, and that would be the end of the family. This is a classic example of filial cannibalism. Hundreds were executed or killed by other villagers for cannibalism throughout the Holodomor. Stories like this demonstrate that people resorting to cannibalism is not just some off-chance possibility that only manifests in post-apocalyptic fiction, but that it's a very real possibility, and one that could come to pass quicker than most people think. It may not even require a current famine to be in place. Rather, the descent into this sort of deviant behavior may well be accelerated with suspicions of impending famine. People may want to get the jump on others so they don't get taken down the road. In anticipation of scarcity, they may get proactive. The mind's taboo to cannibalism is easily broken down by the stress caused by slow death via starvation. It is not a question of if, rather when, the urge will arise. Do not be deceived by the decorum of modern Western man. At the height of our civility, we're also more repressed than ever before. Because our own true nature is so alien to us that when it finally presents itself, it will emerge with an explosive intensity, and as fast as we currently come to reject the practice of cannibalism when times are good, is the speed at which it will be taken to in times of great desperation. For those who are so desperately attached to our technologically advanced material world, those who have an abundance of wealth and are impoverished in spirit, will, with the dread of the potential nothingness that awaits them on the other side, they will fight tooth and nail to cling to life and do whatever it takes to survive.